We gaze upon the golden mask of Tutankhamun, the serene majesty of a pharaoh, and our minds conjure images of divine kingship, eternal peace, and boundless prosperity. Ancient Egypt, the land of pyramids, colossal temples, and enigmatic hieroglyphs, often appears in our collective imagination as a beacon of order, spirituality, and timeless beauty. But what if, like the hidden chambers within a pyramid, there lay darker secrets beneath this glittering facade? What if the very practices meant to secure eternal life hinted at an underlying terror, a chilling reality lurking just beneath the surface of their serene faith? Tonight, we peel back the layers of linen and myth to uncover ancient Egypt's darkest secrets. Our journey into these shadows begins where all Egyptian life ultimately led: the grave. The elaborate funerary rituals, culminating in mummification, are perhaps the most iconic aspect of their civilization. But let us not be swayed by the sanitized images of perfect preservation. The process was, in its essence, a brutal, messy, and often gruesome violation of the human body, driven by an obsessive fear of decomposition and the spiritual annihilation it would bring. Imagine the scene. The moment of death, not a peaceful transition, but the chilling realization that the delicate balance of life had ceased. Immediately, the professional embalmers, often from specialized guilds, would begin their grim work. The very first step was perhaps the most unsettling: the extraction of the brain. Through the nose, a long, hooked bronze instrument would be inserted, used to churn the brain matter into a liquid, which was then allowed to drain out. Think of the sheer violence of this act: the breaking of the delicate skull, the destruction of what we consider the seat of consciousness, all to prevent decay. For other, less common methods, the brain might be removed through an incision near the neck, or even, for cheaper mummifications, left to simply decompose within the skull. This was not a gentle procedure. It was a necessary mutilation. Next came the evisceration. A skilled incision, typically on the left flank of the deceased, would be made to allow access to the internal organs. With practiced hands, the embalmers would reach in and systematically remove the lungs, stomach, intestines, and liver. The heart, believed to be the seat of intelligence and emotion, and crucial for the judgment in the afterlife, was almost always left in place, a rare exception to the general rule of removal. These organs, once removed, were not simply discarded. They were ritually washed, sometimes packed with natron, a natural salt mixture or spices, and then carefully placed into canopic jars, each lid shaped like one of the 4 sons of Horus who would protect them. The vast numbers of these organs, once living parts of individuals, now carefully bottled and placed alongside the corpse, speak to an almost obsessive focus on the body's fragmented components. The body itself would then be packed and covered with mounds of natron, a process that could last for up to 40-70 days. This desiccating salt would slowly absorb all moisture, shrinking the flesh, darkening the skin, and transforming the once supple form into a rigid, leathery shell. Imagine the smell in the embalming workshops: a pungent mixture of natron, spices, and the lingering odor of decay, a constant reminder of mortality. This prolonged drying period was crucial, a waiting game as the body slowly, irrevocably, surrendered its liquid essence. Finally, the now mummified cadaver would be meticulously wrapped in hundreds of yards of linen bandages, often imbued with resin. This was not just for preservation. Countless amulets, charms, and protective spells would be interspersed within the layers, intended to ward off malevolent spirits and guide the deceased safely through the perils of the underworld. Each layer, each knot, was a prayer, a desperate hope for immortality. But even this final act of devotion could reveal unsettling truths. Some mummies show signs of hasty or careless wrapping, bodies broken or poorly aligned. suggesting that not every deceased received the ideal treatment, perhaps due to cost, time, or the sheer volume of dead bodies requiring eternal preparation. The true horror, however, lay in the underlying anxiety. All this gruesome effort was born of a profound fear, the fear of oblivion. For the Egyptians, true death was not the cessation of breath, but the second death in the afterlife, the complete annihilation of the spirit if the body was not preserved, or if it failed the judgment before Osiris. This constant, pervasive dread of being consumed by the monstrous Ammit, the devourer of the dead, or of forever wandering in spiritual darkness, drove their elaborate, often terrifying funerary practices. Their serene images of the afterlife masked a deep-seated terror of ultimate non-existence, a terror that demanded the violation and transformation of the very vessel of life into a desiccated, ritualistically prepared corpse. We have lifted the lid on the tomb, revealing the visceral truths of mummification. But let us now step back from the opulent embalming chambers of the elite and descend into the dusty, cramped reality of daily life for the vast majority of ancient Egyptians. The grand narratives often focus on pharaohs, priests, and monumental construction, but for the common farmer, fisherman, or artisan, life was a relentless cycle of toil, hardship, and vulnerability, far removed from the idealized frescoes of eternal abundance. This was a life lived on the knife edge of survival, where luxury was unimaginable and grim struggle was the norm. Imagine waking before dawn in a small, mud-brick dwelling, often shared with livestock, the air thick with dust and the smell of cooking fires. Breakfast would be a simple affair. Bread, perhaps some onions or dates, washed down with beer, a staple for all ages, more nutritious and safer than water. This basic diet formed the core of their sustenance, often lacking in variety or sufficient protein. Malnutrition, while not always leading to immediate death, was a chronic condition for many, weakening their bodies and making them susceptible to a host of diseases. Skeletons from common cemeteries often bear the telltale signs of dietary deficiencies, growth arrest lines on bones, and enamel hypoplasia on teeth. The working day was dictated by the sun and the rhythms of the Nile. For farmers, the vast majority of the population, life was a continuous cycle of planting, tending, and harvesting, all dependent on the annual inundation of the river. The labor was backbreaking, performed with rudimentary tools under the relentless Egyptian sun. Think of plowing heavy soil with an ox-drawn plow, sowing seeds by hand, or tirelessly working the shaduf, a water-lifting device to irrigate fields. There were no weekends, no holidays in the modern sense. Rest was minimal, usually confined to religious festivals or the enforced idleness of the flood season. The relentless physical strain took a heavy toll on their bodies, leading to widespread arthritis, spinal problems, and joint damage from an early age. Beyond farming, other professions offered little respite. Fishermen spent long hours on the Nile, battling its currents and dangers for their catch. Craftsmen labored in hot, dusty workshops, often inhaling harmful particulates from stone, wood, or metalwork, leading to respiratory ailments. Potters and weavers worked tirelessly to produce essential goods, their lives just as bound by the demands of production and the strictures of their social roles. There was little social mobility. You were largely born into your profession, and your children would likely follow the same path. Dreams of rising above one station were for most just that, dreams. Housing was basic and cramped. Most families lived in small, single-story mud brick homes, sometimes lacking proper ventilation or sanitation. Privacy was a luxury few could afford. The close proximity to animals, the open sewers, and the omnipresent insects created breeding grounds for disease. Infant mortality rates were shockingly high, a constant source of heartbreak for parents. Childbirth was perilous for both mother and child, and many women died young due to complications. If a child survived infancy, they faced a childhood marked by early labor, often assisting their parents in the fields or workshops, learning the trade that would define their adult lives. Play was a luxury, education a rarity reserved for the elite or those destined for scribal schools. Healthcare, as we will explore further, was rudimentary, and access to skilled practitioners limited to the wealthy. For the common person, ailments were often treated with folk remedies, prayers, or simply endured. A broken bone, a severe infection, or a chronic illness could mean the end of one's ability to work, rendering a family destitute. Disability was a sentence to a life of dependence, with little in the way of social support beyond family or community charity. And then there was the ever-present threat of famine. While the Nile generally provided, an insufficient flood or an agricultural blight could spell disaster for an entire region, pushing communities to the brink of starvation. Ancient texts, though rare, sometimes speak of periods of extreme hunger, where people resorted to desperate measures for survival. This constant vulnerability to the whims of nature added another layer of anxiety to an already arduous existence. The common Egyptian lived a life of quiet resignation, bound by the rhythms of the Nile, the demands of the state, and the harsh realities of their environment. Their dreams were not of conquest or grand monuments, but of a sufficient harvest, a healthy family, and a peaceful passage to the field of reeds. The glittering legacy of ancient Egypt, for all its splendor, was built upon the relentless, largely unheralded toil and suffering of its unseen millions. Their lives were not silent in their time, filled with the cries of children, the creak of the shaduf, and the murmur of prayers. But to us, in the vastness of history, their struggles often remain unheard, buried beneath the weight of monumental glory. We have journeyed into the shadows of daily life and the chilling mechanics of death. But the darkness we seek is not confined to the suffering of the masses or the embalmer's gruesome craft. It permeated the very pinnacle of Egyptian society, the royal court, a place of immense power, unimaginable wealth, and the constant threat of conspiracy, where the divine aura of the pharaoh could not shield him from the most intimate forms of betrayal. Here, amidst the gilded splendor, plots festered, curses were whispered, and the line between divine will and human malice often blurred. The pharaoh was considered a living god, the embodiment of Horus, ensuring cosmic order mad. To challenge his authority was not merely treason, it was sacrilege, an act that threatened the very stability of the universe. Yet history, even in its carefully curated Egyptian version, provides chilling glimpses into the vulnerability of this divine figure. The most infamous of these is the harem conspiracy against Ramesses III, dating to the New Kingdom, approximately 1155 BCE. It is a tale that rips away the veneer of divine tranquility, revealing a brutal struggle for power within the most intimate confines of the palace. The judicial papyrus of Turin, a fragmentary but invaluable document, lays bare the horrifying details of this plot. It wasn't a foreign invasion that threatened Ramesses III, but a conspiracy orchestrated from within his own royal harem by one of his secondary wives, Tui, who desperately sought to place her son, Pentueret, on the throne instead of the designated heir. Imagine the simmering resentment, the clandestine meetings in shadowy corridors, the whispered promises, and the desperate ambition that festered behind the opulent walls of the harem. This was not a place of serene concubines. It was a hotbed of intense political maneuvering, where beauty and proximity to the king were potent weapons. The conspiracy was far-reaching, involving not just disgruntled wives and ambitious sons, but high-ranking court officials, army officers, and even household servants. They planned to use magic, both offensive and defensive, to achieve their aims. The papyrus details how magical wax figures were made, spells were recited to weaken the pharaoh and his guards, and a network of conspirators was activated throughout the palace. The very fabric of court life, built on trust and loyalty, was riddled with spies and traitors. The outcome of the conspiracy is chillingly documented. While the details of the assassination attempt are not explicitly stated, the papyrus records the swift and brutal trials of the conspirators. The language used is stark and unforgiving. Those found guilty faced agonizing deaths. Some were burned alive, others impaled on stakes, while high-ranking individuals like Prince Pentueret were given the privilege of committing suicide by poison, a less overtly brutal but equally final judgment. The mummified remains of Ramesses III himself, when examined with modern technology, showed a wide, deep cut to his throat, suggesting that the conspiracy ultimately succeeded in its primary goal of regicide. This silent wound, millennia later, screamed the truth of a pharaoh's violent end. Beyond this famous conspiracy, other hints of royal vulnerability exist. While direct evidence of other pharaohs being assassinated is rare, the practice of damnatio memoriae, the systematic erasure of a ruler's name and image from monuments, speaks volumes. Akhenaten's revolutionary reign was largely erased by later pharaohs who considered him a heretic. This was not mere historical revisionism. It was an attempt to obliterate a pharaoh from the collective memory, and crucially, to deny them their eternal afterlife by destroying the very inscriptions that would allow their Ka and Ba to endure. It was a posthumous curse, a chilling act of spiritual annihilation by political decree. The opulent tombs, laden with curses against would-be desecrators, also speak to a pervasive fear of violation, not just by common robbers, but perhaps by political rivals seeking to destroy a pharaoh's path to eternity. These curses, often inscribed in ominous hieroglyphs, were meant to invoke divine wrath, disease, and misfortune upon anyone who dared to disturb the sacred rest. They were a final, desperate magical defense against the human greed and malice that even death could not escape. Thus, the dazzling light of pharaonic power cast long, unsettling shadows. The harem conspiracy and other subtle hints of internal strife reveal a royal court that, despite its divine pretensions, was a perilous arena of ambition, betrayal, and violence. The serene images on temple walls conceal a reality where the greatest threat often came not from foreign lands, but from within the very palace walls, turning the sacred game of succession into a bloody struggle for the throne. We have seen the political darkness lurking beneath the pharaoh's gilded mask. Now let us turn our gaze to a different, yet equally unsettling, aspect of ancient Egyptian life: the macabre realities of their medical practices. While celebrated for their advancements in surgery and a surprisingly sophisticated understanding of anatomy gained, no doubt, from mummification, Egyptian medicine was a paradoxical blend of empirical knowledge and chilling superstition, where healing often involved remedies that defy modern understanding and would induce revulsion. The Ebers Papyrus and the Edwin Smith Papyrus, two of the most significant medical texts from ancient Egypt, reveal a sophisticated understanding of certain ailments. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, for instance, details surgical procedures with astonishing clarity, including the diagnosis and treatment of fractures, dislocations, and wounds. It speaks of observation, prognosis, and the use of sutures, splints, and even cauterization. Imagine a surgeon, thousands of years ago, skillfully resetting a broken bone or stitching a wound, demonstrating a level of practical knowledge that rivals many pre-modern societies. They understood the connection between pulse and heart, and even had a rudimentary grasp of the brain's function. However, alongside this empirical wisdom existed a horrifying reliance on remedies born of pure superstition and ingredients that would turn the strongest stomach. For the Egyptians, illness was often attributed not just to physical causes, but to malevolent spirits, curses, or divine displeasure. This meant that treatment often involved not just physical interventions, but elaborate rituals, incantations, and concoctions designed to drive out the unseen evil. Consider some of the ingredients detailed in their medical papyri. For various ailments, remedies included bat's blood, lizard's blood, pig's teeth, putrid meat, and even human excrement. For instance, a common remedy for eye infections involved applying a mixture containing human brains to the affected area. Imagine the stench, the risk of further infection, and the sheer revulsion of such a treatment. For gastrointestinal issues, crocodile dung was sometimes prescribed, while a mixture of ground-up mouse and other ingredients might be used for coughs. The logic was often sympathetic magic, using something repulsive to repel illness, or something associated with strength to convey it. But the reality was a potent mix of ineffective, unhygienic, and often dangerous concoctions. The field of dentistry was particularly grim. While some basic extractions and attempts at stabilizing loose teeth were made, severe dental problems were endemic due to their diet, which was often coarse and abrasive, filled with sand and grit from grinding grain with stone mills. Abscesses, severe tooth decay, and agonizing pain were commonplace. Without effective pain relief or antiseptic, extractions would have been excruciating, and infections often led to facial disfigurement or death. The mummified remains frequently show evidence of widespread and severe dental pathology, suggesting a lifetime of oral agony for many Egyptians. Childbirth was another terrifying ordeal. While midwives provided assistance, the lack of modern understanding of hygiene and anatomy meant that complications were frequent, and maternal and infant mortality rates were incredibly high. Records speak of spells and amulets used to protect mother and child, highlighting the deep anxiety surrounding this vulnerable period. A woman in labor faced not just physical pain, but the very real possibility of her own death or the loss of her child. Moreover, the line between physician and priest and between medicine and magic was often blurred. Many healers were also priests, and their treatments often involved spells, amulets, and offerings to the gods, alongside practical applications. This wasn't necessarily a weakness. It reflected their holistic worldview where the physical, spiritual, and divine were intrinsically linked. But it also meant that a serious illness might lead one down a path of bizarre and unsettling rituals, hoping to appease an angry deity or expel a demon, rather than receiving purely empirical care. The silence of many ancient skeletons, however, speaks the loudest. They bear the marks of diseases and conditions that Egyptian medicine, for all its occasional brilliance, simply could not overcome. Tuberculosis, smallpox, various parasitic infections, and chronic arthritis from hard labor. For every successful bone setting, there were countless individuals who succumbed to infections from untreated wounds, agonizing parasitic infestations, or chronic pain that modern medicine easily alleviates. Thus, the macabre world of ancient Egyptian medicine stands as a chilling reminder that even in a civilization renowned for its scientific prowess, the boundaries of understanding were often crossed into the realm of the truly unsettling. Their efforts to combat illness were a desperate dance between empirical observation and superstitious belief, leaving behind a legacy of both astonishing insight and genuinely disturbing practices, a dark mirror reflecting the constant, often painful battle against mortality. We have looked upon the shadows of ancient Egyptian life, health, and royal intrigue. But beneath the veneer of ordered society, enforced by the divine pharaoh and the concept of mad, cosmic order and justice, lay a grim reality, an unforgiving system of law and punishment that could be brutally swift, agonizingly severe, and designed not just to punish the body, but to spiritually annihilate the wrongdoer. This was a justice system less concerned with rehabilitation and more with retribution, deterrence, and the maintenance of an absolute divine order, often through methods that make us recoil even today. Egyptian law, though not codified in the same way as later Roman law, was based on custom, royal decrees, and the concept of mad. Justice was dispensed by local councils, kenbit, scribes, and high-ranking officials, ultimately overseen by the pharaoh. While seemingly structured, the process could be arbitrary, and the outcome for the accused often depended heavily on their social status and the severity of the alleged crime. Testimony, even under duress, was crucial. Punishments for serious offenses were terrifyingly direct and physical. Flogging was common for a wide range of crimes, from minor theft to insubordination. Imagine being stripped naked, bound, and subjected to dozens or even hundreds of lashes from a foreman's stick or a soldier's whip. The pain would be excruciating, the skin torn, leading to severe infection and disfigurement, often for life. This was not merely a deterrent. It was a public spectacle of humiliation and agonizing suffering, designed to instill fear and enforce obedience. For crimes against the state, sacrilege, or particularly egregious acts of theft, especially tomb robbery, which was a crime against the divine order, the punishments escalated to truly horrifying levels. Mutilation was a common practice. Thieves might have their hands, noses, or ears cut off. This served not only as a brutal punishment, but also as a permanent mark of shame, identifying the criminal for life and making it impossible for them to ever fully reintegrate into society. Imagine living with such a disfigurement, a constant public reminder of your transgressions, ostracized and condemned. The psychological toll of such a life would be unimaginable. Perhaps one of the most chilling forms of execution was impalement. While not as frequently documented as some other punishments, it was used for the most severe crimes, particularly treason or major sacrilege. The condemned would be impaled on a sharp stake, which was driven through their body, leaving them to die a slow, agonizing death in public view. The spectacle was meant to be a terrifying warning, a horrific tableau of defiance met with absolute, divine retribution. The sheer agony, the prolonged suffering, and the public humiliation of this death were designed to be a definitive statement of the pharaoh's unyielding authority. Burning alive was another method of execution reserved for the gravest offenses, particularly for those implicated in the harem conspiracy against Ramesses III. This punishment was not just about inflicting pain, it had a profound spiritual significance for the Egyptians. To be burned was to be utterly destroyed, body and soul. For a people obsessed with preserving the body for the afterlife, this was the ultimate condemnation, a denial of eternal existence, a horrific second death that erased one from the cosmic order forever. Imagine the terror of facing such a fate, not just the physical torment but the spiritual annihilation that followed. For high-ranking officials or members of the royal family involved in treason, a privilege was sometimes extended, the option of committing suicide, often by poison. While seemingly less brutal than public impalement or burning, it was still a definitive sentence of death, delivered by their own hand, but maintaining a semblance of dignity compared to public execution. This privilege also served to suppress direct evidence of official wrongdoing or regicide, allowing the state to maintain its narrative of divine order even in the face of internal dissent. Beyond the physical, There was the constant threat of confiscation of property and forced labor in mines or quarries, particularly for lesser offenses or as a punishment for entire families or villages that fell out of favor. These were often death sentences in all but name, due to the brutal working conditions, lack of food, and prevalence of disease. The justice system of ancient Egypt, therefore, for all its adherence to mad, revealed a deeply harsh and often terrifying reality. It was a world where transgressions were met with uncompromising brutality, where punishment was designed not just to correct, but to utterly break the individual, both physically and spiritually. The serene images of pharaohs upholding justice on temple walls masked a dark underbelly of fear, pain, and the chilling finality of a system that tolerated no deviation from its divinely ordained order. We often imagine the armies of ancient Egypt as triumphant forces, their pharaohs leading them to glorious victories, depicted on temple walls smiting their enemies with divine might. Indeed, the military prowess of empires like the New Kingdom was formidable, extending Egyptian influence far beyond the Nile Valley. Yet behind the grand narratives of conquest and the stylized depictions of valor lay the grim, brutal reality of ancient warfare, an unseen horror for the common soldier, a terrifying ordeal for the conquered, and a systematic exercise in violence that left deep, enduring scars. This was not merely about territorial gain or wealth. It was often about brutal suppression, about the assertion of dominance, and about the chilling treatment of those who dared to defy the pharaoh's will. Life, as an Egyptian soldier, was far from the idealized image. While some may have found glory or advancement, the vast majority faced arduous training, grueling marches across unforgiving deserts, and the constant threat of disease, even more so than the actual battlefield. Dysentery, heatstroke, and various infections could decimate an army before a single arrow was fired. Imagine long days under the blistering sun, burdened by heavy equipment, subsisting on meager rations, all while knowing that a swift, painful death awaited in battle, or worse, a lingering demise from a festering wound far from home. The tools of war were primitive by modern standards, yet terrifyingly effective at close quarters. Swords, spears, bows, and axes could inflict gruesome injuries, shattered bones, severed limbs, and agonizing internal damage. There was no concept of battlefield medicine as we know it. A serious wound often meant a slow, agonizing death or lifelong crippling. When battle was joined, it was a chaotic, bloody spectacle. Massed infantry clashes, the thunder of chariots, the hail of arrows, all contributed to a cacophony of fear, pain, and death. Unlike the orderly lines depicted in art, real combat was often a desperate, brutal melee, where individual skill and sheer ferocity determined survival. The psychological toll must have been immense. Soldiers witnessed their comrades fall, endured the screams of the wounded, and were forced to inflict similar horrors upon their enemies. The constant exposure to violence, the terror of imminent death, and the grim necessity of killing would have left deep, unshakable scars on the minds of those who survived. There was no concept of post-traumatic stress, only the silent, invisible suffering that would follow them home if they returned at all. And for the conquered, the fate could be even more horrifying. While the Egyptians were not unique in their brutality in ancient warfare, their methods of dealing with defeated enemies and rebellious populations were often chillingly pragmatic. Massacres of resisting cities or tribes were not uncommon, serving as a brutal message to others who might consider defying Egyptian authority. Archaeological evidence, such as skeletal remains with signs of violence, sometimes corroborates these grim historical records. The very ground they fought on absorbed the blood and despair of countless nameless victims. Perhaps one of the darkest aspects was the systematic taking of prisoners of war, and the treatment they received. Captured enemies were often paraded in humiliating processions, bound and shackled, to be presented before the pharaoh and the cheering populace. This public spectacle served as a powerful display of the pharaoh's might and a stark warning to any internal dissenters. Their fate was often grim. While some might be incorporated into Egyptian society as servants or laborers, many were destined for forced labor in quarries, mines, or on grand building projects, often the very structures that celebrated Egypt's military triumphs. These were grueling, dangerous environments where life was cheap, and death from exhaustion, accident, or disease was a common occurrence. The conditions in these labor camps would have been brutal, a stark contrast to the idealized images of contented workers building pyramids. Beyond forced labor, there is unsettling evidence of even more barbaric practices, though their prevalence is debated. Some reliefs depict the pharaoh holding bound prisoners by their hair, ready to smite them with a mace. While often symbolic, these images underscore a cultural acceptance of extreme violence against enemies. There are also accounts of enemy leaders being summarily executed or even tortured. The concept of showing mercy to a defeated foe, while present in some contexts, was often secondary to the political necessity of demonstrating absolute power and deterring future rebellion. The Egyptians, like many ancient peoples, understood that fear was a powerful tool of control. One particularly disturbing practice, often depicted in tomb and temple reliefs, was the collection of hands or phalli from slain enemies after battle. These grisly trophies, piled before the pharaoh, served as a tangible count of enemy casualties and a gruesome testament to the victory. Imagine the scene. The aftermath of battle, the cries of the wounded, and then the systematic mutilation of the dead, all for the sake of a macabre tally. This practice, while providing a clear metric of success for the ancient chroniclers, speaks to a dehumanizing aspect of warfare, reducing the defeated enemy to mere body parts, devoid of individuality. It stripped them of their dignity even in death, a final act of subjugation. Even diplomacy, when it occurred, was often conducted from a position of overwhelming power, backed by the implicit threat of military might. Treaties were signed, but loyalty was often ensured through fear rather than mutual respect. The constant need for raw materials, particularly gold and other valuable resources from Nubia or the Near East, frequently led to punitive expeditions against rebellious vassals or outright invasions. These were not defensive wars, but campaigns of resource extraction and imperial expansion, fueled by the insatiable demands of the pharaoh's court and the burgeoning temple complexes. The wealth that flowed into Egypt often had a dark provenance, paid for in blood and subjugation. The legacy of Egyptian warfare, therefore, is not just one of strategic brilliance and logistical marvel, but also one of profound human suffering. The triumphant reliefs and inscriptions tell only one side of the story. The other side, etched in the memories of the conscripted soldiers, the broken bodies of the vanquished, and the despair of the enslaved, remains largely untold in the official records. It is a testament to the fact that even a civilization as glorious and sophisticated as ancient Egypt rested upon foundations of grim realities, where the pursuit of power often eclipsed the value of human life, leaving an indelible mark of horror on the sands of time. Beyond the grand temples and the serene images of gods and goddesses, the religious landscape of ancient Egypt harbored its own set of dark secrets and unsettling practices, often controlled by a powerful and enigmatic priesthood. While the pharaoh was the supreme earthly representative of the gods, it was the priests who served as the direct intermediaries, interpreting divine will, performing sacred rituals, and wielding immense influence over the lives of common Egyptians. Their power was not always benevolent. It was a force that could be used for manipulation, for economic gain, and for maintaining a rigid social order, often through fear and strict adherence to arcane dogma. The Egyptian pantheon was vast and complex, encompassing hundreds of deities, each with specific domains and associated cults. While some cults, like those of Ra or Osiris, were central to national identity, others existed in the shadows, their practices more obscure, their demands sometimes chilling. Animal worship, a prominent feature of Egyptian religion, could take on unsettling forms. While many animals, like cats, falcons, and crocodiles, were revered as embodiments of specific deities, the veneration could extend to the mummification of vast numbers of animals, not just as pets, but as offerings or sacred embodiments of the divine. Imagine the sheer scale of operations required to breed, kill, and mummify millions of animals. Ibis, cats, baboons, and more to be entombed in vast catacombs. This industrial-scale animal death, while driven by fervent belief, stands in stark contrast to our modern sensibilities, hinting at a darker, almost obsessive side of their devotion. These weren't just cherished companions, they were sacred conduits, often sacrificed and entombed to intercede with the gods on behalf of the living. The power of the priesthood was immense. They controlled vast tracts of fertile land, amassed enormous wealth through temple offerings and taxation, and held significant political sway, often rivaling the authority of the pharaoh himself, particularly during periods of weak central government. The high priests of Amun at Karnak, for instance, accumulated so much power during the late New Kingdom that they effectively ruled Upper Egypt, creating a theological state that bypassed the pharaoh's direct control. This unchecked power could lead to corruption, nepotism, and the exploitation of the populace. Temples were not just centers of worship. They were economic engines, employing thousands, controlling resources, and influencing every aspect of daily life. The common Egyptian might toil their entire lives, their surplus produce funneled into the coffers of the temples, ostensibly for the gods, but ultimately enriching the priestly elite. Moreover, the priests were the custodians of arcane knowledge, including the intricate rituals of the afterlife, the interpretation of omens, and the composition of powerful spells. This knowledge was often closely guarded, passed down through generations within priestly families, ensuring their continued indispensability. The Book of the Dead, a collection of spells and incantations intended to guide the deceased through the underworld, was a prime example of this priestly monopoly on sacred knowledge. Only those with the means and connections could acquire a copy, ensuring a more favorable journey to the afterlife. This created a profound spiritual inequality, where salvation itself could be influenced by one's earthly status and access to priestly intervention. The fear of an unprepared journey through the perilous underworld was a potent tool for the priesthood to maintain their influence and ensure continuous offerings. Beyond the formal cults, there were darker, more esoteric practices that hinted at the shadowy fringes of Egyptian religion. While direct evidence of widespread human sacrifice is rare and debated among scholars, often limited to early dynastic periods or specific foundational rituals, the symbolic representation of sacrificing enemies to the gods was common. The pharaoh smiting his foes on temple reliefs served as a perpetual, chilling reminder of divine retribution and the ultimate fate of those who defied cosmic order. The rituals sometimes involved bloodletting, severe fasting, or the use of hallucinogenic plants to induce altered states of consciousness, allowing priests to purportedly commune more directly with the divine or to interpret complex omens. These were not recreational activities, but intense, often dangerous spiritual endeavors. pushing the boundaries of human endurance in pursuit of divine wisdom. The concept of divine judgment, while central to their belief in man, also contained elements of terror. The weighing of the heart against the feather of truth in the Hall of Two Truths, overseen by Osiris and a host of terrifying demon gods, was a profound source of anxiety. The monstrous Ammit, with the head of a crocodile, the body of a lion, and the hindquarters of a hippopotamus, waited patiently to devour the hearts of the unrighteous, ensuring their eternal oblivion. This terrifying image was a powerful tool for social control, reinforcing ethical behavior not just through earthly punishment, but through the terrifying prospect of spiritual annihilation. Imagine living every day under the shadow of this impending judgment, your every thought and deed meticulously observed by unseen divine entities. Even the pharaohs themselves were subject to the whims and interpretations of the priests. When a pharaoh fell ill, or when a crisis struck the land, the priests would be consulted, offering divine guidance or prescribing rituals to appease angered deities. This gave them immense leverage, allowing them to influence political decisions and consolidate their own power. In times of national weakness or crisis, the priesthood often stepped into the vacuum, effectively becoming the true rulers, their pronouncements cloaked in the infallible authority of the gods. The line between spiritual guidance and political manipulation was often thin, almost invisible. The opaque veil of priesthood and cults, therefore, represents a hidden dimension of ancient Egyptian society, a world of immense spiritual authority, economic power, and the occasional unsettling practice. It reveals that beneath the polished veneer of piety and order, there existed a complex system of control, where access to the divine was mediated by a powerful elite, and where the fear of cosmic punishment was as potent a force as any earthly law. The whispers from the shadows of their temples tell a story not just of faith, but of fear, power, and the enduring human desire to control the very essence of the divine. When we gaze upon the awe-inspiring pyramids and the intricate rock-cut tombs of ancient Egypt, we are often struck by the sheer scale of human ingenuity and labor. These monumental structures, built to defy time and secure eternal life for their royal occupants, stand as testaments to a civilization's ambition. Yet beneath the veneer of engineering marvel and divine purpose lies a darker, often unacknowledged truth: the immense human cost, the hidden dangers, and the silent suffering endured by the countless individuals who toiled, sweated, and often died in their construction. These were not just architectural triumphs. They were colossal undertakings that consumed lives as relentlessly as they consumed stone. Consider the Great Pyramid of Giza, a structure so immense that its construction involved moving millions of massive stone blocks, each weighing tons. While the myth of enslaved people building the pyramids has largely been debunked, archaeological evidence points to skilled, paid laborers and seasonal conscripts. Their lives were far from easy. These were men, and likely some women, who lived in purpose-built villages near the construction sites, enduring harsh conditions, performing back-breaking physical labor under the scorching Egyptian sun. Imagine the daily grind, hauling ropes, levering stones, chiseling rock, all under the watchful eyes of foremen. The work was relentless, the pressure immense, and the risks omnipresent. The very act of quarrying the stone was fraught with peril. Workers would use copper chisels, dolerite balls, and brute force to cut massive blocks of limestone and granite from distant quarries, sometimes hundreds of miles away. Transportation involved dragging these multi-ton blocks across vast distances, often over uneven terrain, using sledges and sheer human muscle. The possibility of a rope snapping, a sledge overturning, or a stone shifting was a constant, deadly threat. A single misstep could mean crushed limbs, fatal falls, or being buried alive beneath tons of unforgiving rock. The screams of the injured, the frantic shouts of their comrades, would have been a common sound in these unforgiving environments. These were not mere accidents. They were inevitable consequences of monumental ambition, paid for in flesh and bone. The construction site itself was a labyrinth of ramps, scaffolds, and precarious stone. Working at heights, often without safety equipment, meant that falls were a regular occurrence. The dust, omnipresent and suffocating, would have choked their lungs, leading to respiratory illnesses. The sheer physical exertion, coupled with a rudimentary diet and harsh living conditions, would have taken an immense toll on their bodies, shortening their lifespans. Skeletons found in workers' cemeteries often show evidence of severe arthritis, spinal damage, and broken bones that had healed poorly, a grim testament to a life of perpetual physical suffering. Death, whether from a sudden accident or a slow, debilitating illness, was an ever-present companion to these builders of eternity. Beyond the pyramids, the construction of elaborate rock-cut tombs in places like the Valley of the Kings presented its own unique set of dangers. These tombs were carved deep into the cliffs, requiring miners and artisans to work in cramped, poorly ventilated spaces, often by the flickering light of oil lamps. The air would have been thick with dust, stifling heat, and the acrid smell of sweat and lamp oil. The risk of rock falls, tunnel collapses, or becoming trapped deep within the earth was a constant fear. Imagine the psychological toll of working in such an enclosed, dark, and dangerous environment, day after day, knowing that the very rock around you could become your tomb at any moment. Furthermore, the secrecy surrounding royal tomb construction was paramount. The location of these tombs, their internal layouts, and the methods used to conceal their entrances were closely guarded secrets, known only to a select few: the pharaoh, his trusted vizier, and the chief architects and foremen. The workers themselves, particularly those in the final stages of carving and sealing, might have been housed in isolated villages, like Deir el-Medina, their movements restricted to prevent information leaks. While Deir el-Medina was a relatively privileged community of skilled artisans, the general principle of secrecy and control over the workforce was evident. The fear of tomb robbery, even in ancient times, was so great that every effort was made to ensure that the secrets of the pharaoh's eternal resting place died with the builders themselves, or at least remained locked away by the elite. Some historical accounts even hint at darker methods used to enforce this secrecy. While speculative, the idea of workers involved in the final sealing of a tomb being summarily executed or imprisoned to prevent them from revealing its location or secrets has been suggested by some scholars, though direct archaeological evidence for widespread practice is scarce. However, given the extreme value placed on the security of the pharaoh's tomb and afterlife, and the brutal nature of ancient justice we previously discussed, such a measure, however abhorrent, would not have been entirely out of character for the era. The very concept of going to their grave with the secret could have had a chillingly literal meaning for some. The whispers of such fates would have hung heavy in the air around these sacred construction sites, adding another layer of fear to the already arduous labor. Even after construction, the tombs themselves held hidden dangers for the living. The dry, dusty environments, sealed for millennia, could harbor ancient spores, bacteria, or even toxic gases, released when disturbed. While the idea of a mummy's curse primarily gained traction in the modern era, the physical hazards of entering an undisturbed, airless ancient tomb were very real. Archaeologists and early explorers often succumbed to mysterious illnesses, which we now attribute to pathogens or environmental factors, but which in their time fueled the enduring myth of a supernatural retribution. The very air within those hallowed chambers, meant to preserve the dead, could subtly, invisibly, claim the lives of the living. The monumental legacy of ancient Egypt, therefore, is not merely a tale of architectural genius and divine ambition. It is also a stark reminder of the immense human cost, the silent suffering, and the hidden dangers that lay beneath the surface of their most celebrated achievements. The pyramids and tombs, while symbolizing eternal life for a select few, stand equally as enduring monuments to the harsh realities and often brutal sacrifices of the countless individuals whose lives were consumed in their very creation. They are testaments to a dark side of ambition, where the pursuit of immortality for the elite overshadowed the mortality of the many. While the monumental achievements of ancient Egypt speak of a civilization in harmony with its environment, particularly the life-giving Nile, this symbiotic relationship was a delicate one, constantly threatened by the caprices of nature. Beyond the grand narratives of pharaonic power and divine order lay the silent, insidious terrors of environmental instability, particularly the specter of famine and widespread disease that could sweep through the land, plunging millions into abject suffering and despair. These were the true dark secrets etched not in stone, but in the skeletal remains of its populace and the desperate pleas found in ancient texts. The very existence of Egypt was utterly dependent on the annual flooding of the Nile. This inundation was not just a seasonal event. It was the rhythmic heartbeat of their civilization, depositing fertile silt and watering the parched land. A good flood meant prosperity. A poor one, or one that was too intense, spelled disaster. When the Nile failed to rise sufficiently, or if its waters receded too quickly, the consequences were catastrophic. Crops withered in the fields, livestock perished, and the delicate balance of life was shattered. This wasn't merely economic hardship. It was widespread starvation, leading to mass mortality, internal strife, and even the collapse of central authority. Imagine generations living under this constant existential threat, their survival hanging precariously on the whims of a river. The silent anguish of a parent watching their child succumb to the agonizing pangs of hunger, or the desperation of an entire village reduced to foraging for meager scraps in a barren landscape. These were the true, unrecorded horrors that punctuated periods of low inundation. Historical records, though often glorified, occasionally reveal glimpses of these devastating famines. The famine stela, though dating to a later period, tells a story from the reign of Djoser Old Kingdom, recounting a 7-year famine so severe that people ate their own children. While the veracity of the cannibalism is debated, the text vividly conveys the extreme desperation and social breakdown that such prolonged starvation would inflict. The intermediate periods, times of political fragmentation and civil war, were often exacerbated, if not directly triggered, by sustained periods of low Niles. When the central government weakened, its ability to manage grain reserves and distribute food across the kingdom diminished, turning scarcity into widespread catastrophe. The social order, so meticulously crafted and upheld by Mad, would unravel as desperate people turned on each other, driven by the primal urge to survive. Beyond the failures of the Nile, there were other environmental pressures. Desertification, a slow but relentless creep, constantly threatened to reclaim arable land. The encroachment of sand, the salinization of fields due to improper irrigation over millennia, and the changing climate patterns all contributed to a gradual degradation of the very land that sustained them. These were long-term, almost imperceptible changes that, over centuries, chipped away at the resilience of the agricultural system, making the impact of a poor flood even more devastating. The cumulative effect of these slow environmental decays contributed to the eventual decline of the empire, a silent pervasive enemy more formidable than any foreign invader. Public health crises, often intertwined with these environmental factors, were another dark reality. The dense populations living alongside the Nile, coupled with rudimentary sanitation, created fertile breeding grounds for disease. We've touched on diseases in earlier segments, but the sheer scale of outbreaks must be understood. Contaminated water sources, exacerbated during low floods when people congregated around dwindling pools, led to rampant parasitic infections like schistosomiasis, bilharzia, which would have sapped the strength and vitality of countless individuals. Mosquito-borne illnesses like malaria were endemic, causing recurrent fevers, debilitating weakness, and high mortality rates, especially among children. The continuous, low-grade suffering from these chronic illnesses would have been a pervasive reality, a silent burden carried by the majority of the population. Furthermore, the practices surrounding animal mummification, while religiously significant, could have contributed to disease transmission. The handling of thousands, even millions, of animal carcasses, often in close proximity to human settlements, presented potential vectors for zoonotic diseases. While the Egyptians revered animals, their close living conditions with livestock and wild animals also meant constant exposure to pathogens. The lack of understanding about germ theory, of course, meant that preventative measures were non-existent, allowing these silent scourges to proliferate unchecked. A sneeze, a cough, a handshake, each interaction carried the invisible threat of contagion, turning communal gatherings into potential superspreader events. The archaeological record, particularly the examination of mummified remains, often reveals evidence of these silent sufferings. Tuberculosis lesions in bones, parasitic eggs in internal organs, and the signs of chronic malnutrition during periods of famine. These skeletal whispers tell a grim tale of bodies ravaged not by warfare or direct violence, but by the relentless, often invisible, forces of nature and disease. They are the echoes of millions of lives lived in the precarious balance between sustenance and starvation, health and debilitating illness. The grand narrative of ancient Egypt often focuses on the stability of its dynasties and the ingenuity of its people. But beneath this surface, the constant, existential threat of famine and widespread disease, born from the delicate dance with their environment, was a pervasive and terrifying reality. These were the moments when the veneer of divine order peeled away, revealing a society deeply vulnerable to the merciless power of nature. The silent struggles against these environmental adversaries represent some of the darkest, most profound challenges faced by this remarkable civilization, leaving behind a legacy not just of grandeur, but of enduring human resilience in the face of ecological despair. We have traversed the physical hardships of ancient Egyptian life, the terrors of their justice, the brutal realities of their warfare, and the silent suffering wrought by nature. Now let us pull back another veil, one woven not of linen or stone, but of belief and fear. The pervasive, often chilling, world of Egyptian magic and sorcery. For the ancient Egyptians, magic, or Heka, was not a mere trick or illusion. It was a fundamental force of creation, woven into the very fabric of the cosmos, wielded by gods, pharaohs, and priests alike. Yet, like any potent force, it possessed a dark side, a capacity for malevolence, for curses, for bending the will of others, and for opening pathways to unseen, terrifying entities. Magic permeated every aspect of Egyptian life, from the mundane to the divine. It was used to heal the sick, protect against evil spirits, ensure fertility, and even to influence the judgment of the dead in the afterlife. Amulets, charms, and spells were commonplace, integrated into their daily routines. But Heka was a double-edged sword. Just as it could be used for benevolent purposes, it could also be twisted for nefarious ends, to inflict harm, to conjure misfortune, or to exact revenge. This darker application was known and feared, and those who practiced it were regarded with a mixture of dread and awe. Imagine living in a world where an unexplained illness or a sudden misfortune might not be a random occurrence, but the result of a malevolent spell cast by a disgruntled neighbor or a vengeful rival. The paranoia, the suspicion, that such beliefs would foster are palpable. The practitioners of dark magic, though not always explicitly condemned in the same way as common criminals, were undoubtedly figures of unease. While many priests performed legitimate ritualistic magic for the state, there were also those who operated on the fringes, offering their services for personal gain or to fulfill vengeful desires. These might be skilled scribes who knew how to manipulate hieroglyphic texts for curses, or individuals with a deeper, perhaps forbidden, knowledge of rituals to bind or harm. Their tools could be deceptively simple: effigies of enemies, inscribed with malicious spells and then destroyed, potsherd figures, pierced with needles to inflict pain, or even elaborate, secretive rituals performed under the cloak of night, invoking terrifying deities or demons. The fear of being targeted by such magic was a very real, constant anxiety for many Egyptians. Curses, as we touched upon regarding royal tombs, were a powerful form of negative magic. They were meticulously crafted, often in writing, intended to inflict suffering or eternal damnation upon anyone who violated sacred spaces or defied divine order. But curses were not limited to royal decrees. Individuals might employ curses against those who wronged them, seeking cosmic retribution for earthly injustices. These could range from wishing ill fortune upon a thief to invoking the wrath of powerful gods upon a rival. The psychological impact of believing oneself to be cursed, or of living in a community where such beliefs were rampant, would have been immense. It fostered a climate of caution and fear, where every misfortune could be interpreted as a magical attack, every strange occurrence as a sign of supernatural malevolence. The Book of the Dead, while primarily a guide for the afterlife, also contained sections that alluded to protection against dark magic and hostile entities in the underworld. The spells were not just passive prayers, they were active incantations, magical formulas designed to overcome obstacles, deceive demons, and ensure the deceased's passage. This highlights the belief that even in death, one was not safe from malevolent Heka or spiritual threats. The very journey to paradise was fraught with unseen magical dangers, requiring knowledge and power to navigate. The spells often involved transforming the deceased into various powerful animals or divine beings, effectively giving them magical defenses against the perils of the afterlife. Demons and malevolent spirits were a very real part of the Egyptian cosmos, distinct from the benevolent gods. These were often grotesque, terrifying entities that inhabited the liminal spaces, the desert, the dark corners of houses, the underworld. They could inflict illness, cause nightmares, or lead travelers astray. Magic was essential for protection against them. Amulets depicting protective deities like Taweret, the hippopotamus goddess, or Bes, the dwarf god, were commonly worn to ward off these unseen threats. Rituals of exorcism, though less documented than other medical practices, undoubtedly existed, designed to expel malevolent entities from the afflicted. The constant vigilance against these unseen foes would have added a layer of subtle, pervasive fear to daily life. Even within the formal religious system, some deities possessed particularly terrifying aspects, invoked for destructive purposes. Sekhmet, the lion-headed goddess of war and pestilence, could unleash plagues upon humanity. Set, the god of chaos, storms, and the desert, represented the darker, unpredictable forces of the universe. While these gods were part of the balance, their destructive capacities were acknowledged and sometimes invoked, perhaps in moments of desperation or divine judgment. The line between invoking a deity for protection and petitioning them for destructive power was thin, and depended heavily on the intent of the practitioner. The manipulation of divine names and secret words was also a powerful magical technique. The true name of a god or demon was believed to hold immense power over them. Learning these names or using them in incantations could compel deities or spirits to do one's bidding. This was a closely guarded secret, known only to the most learned priests and magicians. The discovery of such a name or its misuse could unleash catastrophic consequences. This secret knowledge was a source of immense power for the priestly class, further solidifying their control over both the spiritual and temporal lives of the populace. In essence, the world of ancient Egyptian magic was not simply about a belief in charms and potions. It was a complex, nuanced system that acknowledged the inherent duality of cosmic forces, their capacity for both creation and destruction. For the Egyptians, Heka was a vital, active component of their reality, a constant presence that could either protect or destroy. It cultivated a sense of mystery and power, but also a deep-seated fear of unseen forces, of vengeful spirits, and of the malevolent intentions of those who dared to harness the darkest aspects of the universe. This pervasive belief in the power of magic, both benign and malign, adds another fascinating, yet unsettling dimension to the hidden truths of this ancient civilization. A dimension where the ordinary could quickly become extraordinary, and the unseen could profoundly affect the seen. We have spoken of the pharaohs, elaborate efforts to secure their eternal rest, constructing monumental tombs filled with unimaginable riches, sealed against the ravages of time and the covetous desires of mortals. Yet, one of the most persistent and ultimately successful dark forces they contended with was not the wrath of gods or the machinations of rivals, but the insidious, relentless scourge of tomb robbing. This was a dark secret that gnawed at the very heart of Egyptian funerary beliefs, a direct assault on the promise of the afterlife, and a testament to the desperate lengths to which human greed and necessity could drive individuals. The silent, empty chambers of many grand tombs today whisper not of eternal peace, but of violent intrusion and methodical plunder. For the ancient Egyptians, tomb robbing was not merely theft. It was an act of sacrilege of the highest order. The tomb was a sacred space, the eternal dwelling of the deceased, designed to safeguard their body, their ka and their ba, and to provide the sustenance needed for their journey through the underworld. To desecrate a tomb, to steal its contents, was to condemn the deceased to a terrifying oblivion, disrupting their eternal cycle and denying them their promised paradise. The fear of this spiritual annihilation was profound, driving the pharaohs and wealthy elite to construct increasingly elaborate and secure burial places. Yet time and again, these defenses proved tragically futile against the cunning, perseverance, and often desperate motives of the robbers. The motives for tomb robbing were in essence quite simple: immense wealth. The sheer quantity of gold, precious stones, fine linens, and valuable artifacts interred with the elite represented an irresistible temptation. While the official records speak of divine justice and brutal punishments for those caught, the reality was that tomb robbing became a persistent, almost institutionalized problem, particularly during periods of economic hardship or political instability. The New Kingdom, despite its wealth, saw extensive tomb robberies, to the point where an official investigation and trials were documented in the Ramesside period, revealing the shocking extent of the problem and implicating even some high-ranking officials. Imagine a society where the very custodians of the dead were complicit in their desecration. The act of robbing a tomb was a dangerous, often terrifying endeavor. Robbers faced not only the risk of being caught and subjected to gruesome punishments, impaling, burning, or mutilation, but also the very real physical dangers of the tombs themselves, collapsing passages, hidden pits, or the suffocation from ancient, stale air. They often worked in total darkness, by the flickering light of a single lamp, navigating treacherous corridors designed to confuse and deter. The psychological aspect must have been immense, operating in the silent, sacred spaces of the dead, surrounded by the remnants of powerful rituals and the lingering spiritual presence of the deceased, knowing that every disturbed object might unleash a curse. Yet, the lure of unimaginable riches often outweighed these very real fears. The methods employed by tomb robbers were surprisingly sophisticated. They were not merely opportunistic grave desecrators. Many were skilled craftsmen, perhaps even former tomb builders themselves, who understood the architecture and weaknesses of the burial complexes. They knew how to bypass false walls, locate hidden passages, and disarm rudimentary traps. They might tunnel for months, starting far from the main entrance to avoid detection, patiently chipping away at solid rock. They often worked in organized gangs, sharing the spoils and the risks. The detailed confessions from the Ramesside period trials reveal these methods, describing how they would break into a tomb, methodically strip the mummies of their jewelry and amulets, and often dismember the bodies in their haste, scattering the bones. This deliberate destruction of the mummified remains was the ultimate sacrilege, sealing the fate of the deceased. The reuse and desecration of tombs by later generations of Egyptians adds another layer of darkness. During periods of economic decline or political chaos, later pharaohs or even common people would sometimes appropriate older tombs, clearing out the previous occupants, or simply pushing their remains aside to make way for new burials. This was a pragmatic act born of necessity, but it was also a profound insult to the original owner's afterlife. Their names might be chiseled off, their images defaced, and their funerary goods repurposed. This was a slow, systemic form of tomb desecration, stripping the deceased of their identity and their pathway to eternity, not by common criminals but by the very descendants of their civilization. The grand narratives of continuous dynastic rule often overlook these grim details of internal strife and the cyclical disrespect shown to the dead. The cachette finds, particularly the discovery of royal mummies reburied in hidden, communal tombs at Deir el-Bahari and the tomb of Amenhotep II, are a chilling testament to the severity of the tomb robbing problem. Priests, in desperate attempts to protect the sacred remains of their pharaohs from rampant plunder, meticulously gathered up dozens of royal mummies from their violated tombs and reinterred them in secret, anonymous locations. Imagine the scene: priests carefully unwrapping and identifying the bodies of their once divine rulers, then rewrapping them for a clandestine reburial, a desperate act to ensure some semblance of eternal peace for their desecrated gods. This act, born of reverence, ironically reveals the extent of the desecration that forced such extraordinary measures. The scourge of tomb robbing, therefore, illuminates a deep crack in the glittering facade of ancient Egypt. It reveals a society where even the most sacred beliefs could be undermined by human desperation and greed, where the sanctity of death was constantly under assault, and where the promise of eternal life was a fragile hope, forever vulnerable to the dark impulses of the living. The vast number of plundered tombs, the scattered remains, and the lost treasures are not just archaeological losses. They are haunting reminders of a constant, desperate battle fought in the shadows, a battle that the deceased, in their eternal slumber, ultimately lost. We often envision the succession of pharaohs as a divinely ordained, seamless transition, a continuous line of living gods ascending the throne. The official records, carved in stone and etched on papyrus, reinforce this image of orderly transfer of power. Yet beneath this carefully constructed facade of divine right and dynastic stability lay a far darker, more treacherous reality. A bloody game of thrones, where ambition often trumped lineage, where rivals schemed in the shadows, and where the ultimate prize, the throne of Egypt, was often secured through violence, betrayal, and even regicide. The annals of pharaonic history are quietly stained with the blood of those who sought power, and those who were eliminated for possessing it. While the principle of primogeniture, succession by the eldest son, was generally favored, it was by no means an absolute law. The pharaoh had many wives, concubines, and children, and the choice of heir could be influenced by a myriad of factors: the mother's status, political alliances, the military's favor, or the influence of powerful priestly factions. This inherent flexibility, while sometimes ensuring a capable ruler, also created fertile ground for intrigue and deadly competition. Imagine the simmering resentment within the royal harem, where secondary wives and their sons vied for the pharaoh's favor, each hoping to elevate their own progeny to the ultimate position of power. These were not just domestic squabbles. They were often life-or-death struggles for the highest office in the land. The harem conspiracy against Ramesses III, which we discussed earlier, is perhaps the most well-documented instance of attempted regicide, but it was likely not an isolated incident. The very existence of such a plot, involving high-ranking officials and royal family members, demonstrates the fragility of even the most powerful pharaoh's position. Imagine the constant fear of poisoning, the need for trusted food tasters, the paranoia that must have permeated the royal court. The annals of ancient Egypt are remarkably silent on direct acts of pharaohs being assassinated, largely because such events would have been suppressed or reinterpreted to maintain the illusion of divine invincibility. However, the discovery of a distinct wound on the mummy of Ramesses III, a wide slit throat, strongly suggests that the conspiracy ultimately succeeded in its primary aim, even if the conspirators were later executed. This silent, brutal evidence shatters the myth of the unassailable divine ruler. Periods of political instability, often referred to as intermediate periods, were particularly rife with such internal power struggles. When a strong pharaoh died without a clear successor, or when central authority weakened, the unified kingdom could fragment into rival factions, each vying for control. Local nomarchs, provincial governors, could declare independence, and multiple individuals might claim the pharaonic title, leading to prolonged civil wars. These were not just distant skirmishes. They were bloody conflicts that devastated the land, disrupted trade, caused widespread famine, and led to immense suffering for the common populace caught between warring lords. The very stability that defined Egypt's golden ages was often preceded or followed by these dark eras of internal strife. Even successful successions were not always clean. A new pharaoh, upon ascending the throne, might systematically erase the memory of his predecessor, particularly if that predecessor was considered illegitimate, a usurper, or simply fell out of favor. This practice of damnatio memoriae, while sometimes motivated by religious reasons, as with Akhenaten, was often a brutal political tool to solidify a new regime's legitimacy. Names were chiseled from monuments, images defaced, and historical records altered. This was a form of posthumous regicide, an attempt to deny the previous ruler their eternal life, and to rewrite history in favor of the victor. Imagine the chilling implications. Not only could your earthly power be stripped away, but your very existence in the afterlife could be annihilated by a vengeful successor. The struggle for power was not limited to direct regicide. The manipulation of prophecies, the forging of documents, and the strategic marriages to consolidate power were all part of this ruthless political game. High priests, powerful generals, and ambitious viziers could become kingmakers, subtly or overtly influencing who would next sit on the throne. The rise of non-royal individuals to the throne, such as Horemheb, a general, or the various strongmen of the Third Intermediate Period, highlights that military strength or administrative prowess could sometimes override royal bloodline, especially in times of crisis. These were not always smooth transfers. They often involved purges of rival factions and the consolidation of power through force and intimidation. The very concept of a pharaoh having many children also contributed to this instability. While it ensured numerous potential heirs, it simultaneously created more contenders and more opportunities for factionalism. The competition between sons, each backed by their respective mothers and their powerful families, could become deadly. The records of some pharaohs who had exceptionally long reigns sometimes hint at a period of co-regency, where an heir was appointed and shared power, perhaps to try and smooth the transition and prevent future disputes. But even this was no guarantee against the ever-present threat of internal conflict. Ultimately, the grand narrative of unbroken pharaonic lines often conceals a much darker, more volatile reality. The throne of ancient Egypt, while symbolic of divine authority, was also a highly coveted prize, a political battlefield where the stakes were nothing less than supreme power and eternal legacy. The quiet whispers of poison, the desperate machinations of the harem, the clash of armies in civil war, and the systematic erasure of predecessors' memories. These are the grim, untold stories of a constant, brutal struggle for supremacy. The stability and grandeur we admire were often hard-won, maintained through a terrifying blend of divine mandate and ruthless political violence. A bloody game of thrones played out on the sands of time. We have marveled at the pyramids, understood the brutal machinations of the royal court, and glimpsed the horrors of ancient warfare. Yet one of the most pervasive, albeit often invisible, dark secrets of ancient Egypt lay in the very structure of its society. The absolute, often unyielding, power of the state over the individual manifest in pervasive control and the relentless demands of corvée labor. This was not a society of widespread chattel slavery, as many once believed, but a system where the lives of the vast majority of its free citizens were meticulously managed, their labor conscripted, and their personal freedoms curtailed, all in the name of the pharaoh, the gods, and the maintenance of cosmic order. The dazzling splendor of the empire was built, in large part on the disciplined, often forced, sweat of its own people. From the humblest farmer to the skilled artisan, every Egyptian was a cog in the vast machine of the state. The pharaoh, as the living god, owned all land and theoretically controlled all resources. This meant that the fields cultivated by farmers were not truly theirs. They were leased from the state or temple, and a significant portion of their yield was exacted as taxes. Imagine the psychological burden of knowing that your entire harvest, the fruit of your backbreaking labor, was subject to the state's demands, leaving you with barely enough for subsistence. These taxes were not always in coinage, which was rare. They were paid in grain, livestock, linen, or labor itself. Scribes, acting as the bureaucratic eyes and ears of the state, meticulously recorded every grain sack, every head of cattle, ensuring that nothing escaped the pharaoh's grasp. This pervasive economic control meant that true economic freedom for the common person was largely an illusion. The most visible and often brutal manifestation of this state control was corvée labor, the system of compulsory, unpaid labor for public works. While not traditional chattel slavery, it was a form of forced service that could last for months, drawing men away from their farms and families. These were the hands that built the pyramids, quarried the stones, dug the canals, and constructed the massive temples that still stand today. Imagine being a farmer just as the crucial planting or harvesting season approaches, suddenly conscripted by royal decree. Your family's livelihood depended on your presence in the fields, but the pharaoh's command was absolute. Failure to report for corvée could lead to severe punishment, including flogging, imprisonment, or even confiscation of property. The pledge of the recruit in the papyrus Lansing, for example, describes a recruit's desperate plea. "Send me not to Syria, send me not to Cush. I am a plowman, not a fighter," illustrating the dread many felt towards state service. The conditions of corvée labor were often harsh in the extreme. Whether building a pyramid under the scorching sun, dragging colossal statues, or digging vast irrigation networks, the work was physically demanding and dangerous. Supervision was strict, and punishments for slacking or insubordination were swift and brutal. Foremen and overseers, often equipped with staffs or whips, ensured constant productivity. The archaeological evidence from workers' villages, while showing a degree of organization and provision, also reveals the signs of hard lives, with widespread skeletal trauma and early deaths. These workers, supposedly free citizens, were effectively bound to the state's will by invisible chains of duty, fear, and economic necessity. Their lives were not their own. They belonged to the pharaoh and his divine mandate. Beyond the physical labor, the state exercised pervasive control over virtually every aspect of life. Scribes, the administrators of the kingdom, maintained meticulous records of populations, resources, and even individual professions. There was little room for social mobility for the vast majority. You were born into your station, and that was largely where you remained. While theoretically possible to rise through the ranks of the military or the bureaucracy, such opportunities were rare and depended heavily on patronage and exceptional talent. For most, life was a cycle of agricultural labor, corvée duty, and devotion to the gods, all within the strictures laid down by the central authority. Even personal freedom of movement was restricted. Peasants were largely tied to their land, forbidden from leaving their villages without official permission. This was to ensure agricultural productivity and to prevent the flight of labor that was so vital to the state's economy. Imagine living your entire life within the confines of your village, your world bounded by the fields you worked and the immediate community, with the distant, almost mythical presence of the pharaoh dictating your very existence. The vastness of Egypt, for most, remained an abstract concept, never truly experienced. The ubiquitous presence of the state was maintained not just by brute force, but by a powerful ideological framework. The pharaoh was not just a king. He was a living god, the embodiment of man. To defy the pharaoh was to defy cosmic order itself, an act of sacrilege that would bring chaos upon the land. This belief system, carefully cultivated by the priestly class, served as a powerful tool of social control, instilling obedience and deterring dissent far more effectively than any whip or jail cell. The visible grandeur of the temples and monuments served as a constant, tangible reminder of the pharaoh's omnipotence and the futility of resistance. In conclusion, while ancient Egypt did not practice widespread chattel slavery in the classical sense, the lives of its common citizens were bound by a different, subtler form of servitude, the invisible chains of state control and compulsory labor. The price of monumental grandeur and centralized power was paid not just in gold and resources, but in the constrained freedoms, the arduous toil, and the silent resignation of millions who dedicated their lives, often unwillingly, to the perpetual glory of the pharaoh and the enduring legacy of a civilization built on their sweat and sacrifice. This pervasive control, a cornerstone of their society, stands as one of the quieter, yet profoundly dark, secrets of the land of the Nile. We began this sleepless journey beneath the golden mask of ancient Egypt, seeking to peel back the layers of reverence and romanticism, to confront the uncomfortable truths and the hidden darknesses that often lie buried beneath the sands of time. Our quest has taken us far beyond the glittering facade of pharaohs and pyramids, revealing a civilization not merely defined by its grandeur, but by its profound and often brutal humanity. We first dared to look beyond the serene images of the afterlife, unearthing the chilling realities of mummification, a process that, for all its spiritual purpose, was an act of dismemberment and reconstruction, fraught with the very human anxieties of eternal oblivion. We then pulled back the curtain on daily life, exposing the omnipresent fears of disease, hunger, and an uncertain future that plagued the common Egyptian, a silent struggle rarely depicted on monumental walls. Our gaze then turned to the halls of power, where pharaonic curses were not just superstitious whispers but potent weapons against perceived enemies, and where harem conspiracies proved that even the divine ruler was vulnerable to the dagger in the dark. Our journey continued into the operating theaters of ancient medicine, where surprising surgical skill coexisted with remedies so grotesque and unhygienic they would sicken modern sensibilities, revealing a desperate battle against invisible ailments. We witnessed the unyielding hand of Egyptian justice, a system that carved its punishments, mutilation, public flogging, burning, not just into flesh but into the very fabric of identity, ensuring a living hell and often an eternal damnation for the condemned. The glorious victories of Egyptian armies were then stripped bare, revealing bloody conflicts where the dignity of the defeated was systematically stripped away through slaughter and enslavement, and where the human cost was tallied in severed hands. Our exploration led us through the opaque veils of priesthood and cult, uncovering a system of spiritual authority that, while central to their cosmos, could morph into economic exploitation and political manipulation, where the fear of divine judgment was a potent tool for control over the masses. We peered into the colossal undertakings of pyramid and tomb construction, understanding the silent suffering of the countless laborers whose sweat, blood, and lives were consumed by monumental ambition, and whose final resting places, despite elaborate defenses, were vulnerable to the very secrets they built. We then grappled with the silent terrors of environmental disaster, famines that ravaged the land and diseases that silently decimated populations, reminding us of the precarious balance upon which their civilization rested, where the life-giving Nile could just as easily bring despair. And in our most recent revelation, we pulled back the curtain on the pervasive state control and the invisible chains of corvée labor that bound millions of free citizens to the will of the pharaoh, making their lives a testament to duty and submission rather than individual liberty, a hidden servitude underpinning the empire's might. Finally, we explored the chilling realities of Egyptian magic and sorcery, understanding that Heka was a fundamental force that could be bent to malevolent purposes, curses, harmful spells, and the summoning of terrifying demons, adding a pervasive layer of fear and paranoia to daily existence, where unseen forces could dictate one's fate. Now, as our sleepless vigil draws to a close, what have these dark secrets truly revealed? They have not diminished the awe we feel for ancient Egypt's achievements. Instead, they have painted a far richer, more complex, and undeniably more human portrait of this extraordinary civilization. The enduring marvels, the pyramids, the temples, the vibrant art, were not born from a utopian paradise, but from a society that grappled with the same fundamental challenges that haunt humanity across millennia: power, survival, fear, faith, control, and the relentless pursuit of order in a chaotic world. The darkness we have uncovered is not a stain on their legacy, but an integral part of their story. It reminds us that behind every grand narrative of empire, every gleaming artifact, and every divine pronouncement, lie the untold stories of everyday struggle, quiet desperation, and profound human suffering. The Egyptians, like all great civilizations, were a people of profound contradictions, deeply spiritual yet fiercely pragmatic, builders of unparalleled beauty yet capable of startling cruelty, masters of organization yet vulnerable to the caprices of nature and the ambitions of their own kind. The whispers from the sarcophagi, the silent screams from the quarries, the desperate pleas of the hungry, the terror of the cursed, and the chilling finality of justice, these are the true echoes of ancient Egypt. They remind us that history is rarely clean, rarely simple. It is a tapestry woven with threads of light and shadow, of triumph and tragedy, of grand designs and grim realities. To truly understand a civilization is not just to celebrate its heights, but to acknowledge its depths. As the first rays of dawn pierce the darkness, casting long shadows across the ancient sands, we leave this nocturnal journey with a new appreciation for the enduring human spirit that thrived amidst such formidable challenges. The dark secrets of ancient Egypt do not lessen its glory. They deepen its profound, inescapable humanity. And in acknowledging these shadows, we gain a truer, more powerful understanding of a civilization that, even in its grim realities, continues to fascinate, to educate, and to haunt the sleepless historian in all of us. The Nile flows on, but its unseen currents still carry the weight of these ancient, powerful truths, whispering across the millennia,